They drove into the woods late on a Friday afternoon, for friends in a dusty silver SUV loaded with weekend supplies. The kind of trip they had done a dozen times before, except this cabin was deeper, older, and cheaper than any they had rented before. A forgotten property listed on a local site with only 2 grainy photos, a porch tilted by time, a chimney clawed by ivy, and an address marked only by a crooked mailbox with faded numbers. Yet the idea of isolation felt like freedom as the road narrowed and the trees closed in, pine and oak mingling in thick curtains that swallowed the last bars of cell signal, laughter filling the car as the late sun made the forest glow with warm amber light, the smell of resin and damp earth slipping through the vents, until they reached the clearing, and the cabin appeared like something pulled from another decade. Roof patched with mismatched shingles, windows clouded by age, and a sagging front step that moaned under their boots. But to Mara it looked charming, her dark hair tied back, camera slung at her side, already snapping photos of peeling paint and the way the light cut across the mossy roof, while Ben, her boyfriend, hauled bags from the trunk, joking about ghosts and backwoods killers, drawing a snort from Hannah, who lit a cigarette and leaned against a tree, her eyes scanning the surrounding woods where shadows pooled thick despite the hour, and Jordan, the quiet one, was fiddling with the lock that stuck before giving way, with a creak that made all of them pause, a sound like something exhaling. But then they laughed again and carried their supplies inside, finding a place that smelled of old wood and damp stone, the air heavy with the faint scent of something metallic they couldn't place. And while the others unpacked, Mara wandered room to room, touching dusty furniture, a faded quilt still folded on a couch, a pair of boots by the door as if someone had left in a hurry and never returned. But she didn't mention it, instead opening a window to let in the cool evening breeze, carrying distant birdsong and the rustle of unseen creatures, the woods alive and endless. And as darkness began to fall, they lit candles, because the wiring hummed unsettlingly when they tried the lights. Ben making a fire, while Hannah found an old record player that somehow still worked, its crackling tunes filling the cabin with an oddly soothing hum, until night settled completely and the woods outside became a wall of black pressing against the glass, the wind rising, making branches claw at the roof, and they drank and laughed and told stories while the fire hissed and the forest watched in silence. Yet sometime near midnight, Mara stepped out onto the porch for air, the moon high and silvering the trees, and she thought she saw movement at the far edge of the clearing. A figure maybe, tall and still, but when she blinked it was gone, replaced by nothing but shadows and the whisper of leaves, and she told herself she was imagining things. Returning inside, though unease gnawed at her. Then later, as they all settled into creaky beds, the night sound seemed to grow sharper. The hoot of an owl, the snap of twigs beyond the walls, the faint rhythmic crunch of footsteps circling the cabin, though when Ben rose and looked through the window there was nothing, only darkness thick enough to choke. So they laughed it off again, blaming animals, the forest, their nerves. But none of them slept easily, and at dawn Mara woke first, the sunlight soft and pale, finding the front door standing slightly open though they had locked it. A single muddy footprint on the porch, large and angled strangely, as though whoever left it had turned their foot unnaturally outward. And in the distance, far beyond the clearing, she thought she heard something like laughter carried by the breeze, low and rough and not quite human. And as she stepped outside, the morning air smelled faintly of smoke, though there was no fire anywhere she could see. Only the endless trees stretching in every direction, the cabin behind her silent as a held breath, her friend still asleep inside, unaware that something unseen had already found them, already begun to watch. ChatGPT. Mara stood on the porch a long moment, her bare feet chilled by the damp boards, eyes scanning the clearing, as if she could will the source of that laughter into view. But the trees only whispered back at her, their tops swaying against the pale sky. And when she finally stepped back inside the cabin, the air felt different, heavier somehow, the wooden floor groaning faintly under her steps as she moved to the kitchen, where sunlight slanted through a grimy window and caught on motes of dust that swirled like tiny spirits. The others still sprawled in their beds, Hannah with an arm draped over her eyes, Jordan curled up on a sagging couch, Ben snoring softly in the small back room, and she told herself again that she was overthinking, that the footprint had belonged to one of them stepping out late in the night, though she could not imagine who would wander barefoot into the woods. And she made coffee on the old propane stove, its hiss filling the silence until the others began to stir. Hannah complaining about the creaks in the floor, Jordan mumbling something about a nightmare, Ben shuffling and rubbing his eyes, and asking if she'd heard the strange sound outside, which made her pause mid-pour, the rich bitter scent of coffee hanging between them as she admitted she had, and a small unease passed through the group, like a shadow, though they laughed it off again, joking that the woods were playing tricks, that city people like them were just not used to true darkness. But the jokes rang hollow as they spent the morning exploring the property, finding a shed out back filled with rusting tools and stacks of firewood and, oddly, several chains neatly coiled and hung on the wall like decorations, Ben pointing at them with a raised brow, Mara taking a photo for fun though she felt her skin prickle, and then Jordan noticed claw marks low on the side of the shed, long parallel gouges that looked too deep for any raccoon or bear, but they said nothing, turning their attention instead to a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest, a ribbon of dirt half swallowed by ferns, and despite the uneasy start they set off together, cameras in hand, Hannah teasing that this was how horror movies began, Mara leading with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the canopy above filtering sunlight into shifting patterns on the ground, the air rich with pine and the distant scent of water, maybe a stream ahead, the only sounds their footsteps and the occasional bird call, until after an hour they reached a rocky rise with a view of endless green, the cabin now hidden, the world spread out beneath them in wild untamed beauty, and for a moment Mara felt the peace she had come for, breathing deeply as Ben took her hand. But then Jordan froze, pointing to something half buried near a fallen log, a tattered scarf caught in roots, its fabric stained dark with something that might have been old mud but looked too much like dried blood, and they all stared at it, the wind catching the edge and lifting it like a limp flag, and the woods suddenly felt smaller, tighter, as if leaning in to listen, Hannah backing away with a nervous laugh, Ben suggesting they head back before the weather turned. Yet as they retraced their steps, Mara kept glancing over her shoulder, convinced she heard something following them just beyond sight, a steady crackle of underbrush that stopped whenever they stopped, and by the time they reached the cabin the sky had clouded over, the air damp and thick, the first hints of rain in the breeze, and that night they lit more candles and tried to shake off the feeling, opening a bottle of wine, playing cards on the old table while the wind rose again outside. But the sense of being watched did not fade, and every so often Mara caught Jordan staring at the window, his hand trembling as he pretended to shuffle the deck, Hannah growing irritable, snapping that they were spooking themselves, Ben trying to lighten the mood with stories of his college pranks, yet no one truly laughed, the candle flames bending as if stirred by a breath that none of them had felt. And later, long after midnight, Mara woke to the sound of the front door creaking slowly open again, though she knew Ben had locked it, and she froze, heart thudding, listening as something heavy moved across the porch, a slow, deliberate pacing, then a whisper she could not understand sliding through the cracks in the wood, her pulse roaring in her ears. As she nudged Ben awake, both of them holding their breath as the pacing stopped and the whispering ceased, the silence that followed thick and absolute, and then a single soft knock at the door, so gentle it was almost polite. But when Ben grabbed a flashlight and yanked the door open, there was nothing, only the black woods, the porch empty, the rain starting to fall in cold silver lines. Yet as Mara stared into the darkness, she thought she saw a figure far down the trail, motionless, too tall, watching, and when she blinked it was gone, leaving her with the echo of that whisper and the growing certainty that something out there wanted them to stay. The next morning was unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that didn't feel like peace, but like the world was waiting for something to happen. The trees outside slick with rain, leaves darkened and dripping, the sky a smothering gray with no sunlight breaking through, and inside the cabin the air had a damp, cold weight as if the walls were sweating from something more than the weather, the floor creaking underfoot as they moved around sluggishly, their energy drained, none of them having slept well, each one startled by dreams they couldn't fully recall. Images of pale faces behind glass, distant footsteps, cold fingers brushing skin, though no one spoke about them openly. Not even Jordan, who normally overanalyzed everything, just averted his eyes and stirred his coffee with slow, mechanical motions while Hannah paced near the window, chewing on a fingernail, flinching whenever the wind knocked a branch against the roof, and Mara, quiet since the moment they had returned from the hike, sat curled in the corner with her camera in her lap, scrolling through her photos from the day before, zooming in on the blurry edge of the image with the tattered scarf, heart thudding faster as she spotted something in the background, barely visible through the trees, a long shadow, a figure standing too far back to be clear, but distinctly humanoid and too still to be an animal. And she said nothing, not wanting to be the one to sound paranoid. Not yet, even though her skin prickled, and her chest felt tight, and Ben noticed, coming over to place a hand on her shoulder, asking if she was okay in a voice softer than usual, but she only nodded, slipping the camera into her bag and forcing herself to smile, saying they should take a drive, maybe into the nearest town to get some fresh air, a break from the cabin, and they all agreed to quickly, piling into the SUV with quiet urgency. But the gravel road out was wetter than expected, muddy ruts pulling at the tires, and less than a mile down, just before the bend near the stream they had passed on the way in, they found the road completely blocked. A fallen tree, thick and heavy, its trunk snapped in a way that didn't look natural, like it had been cut with precision instead of blown over by wind, and Ben got out, cursing as he inspected it, trying to push it alone before Jordan joined him. But it didn't budge, water trickling down the slope beside them and soaking their shoes as they realized they were effectively trapped unless they hiked out, and with no cell signal and dusk already starting to press against the trees, they turned back, the mood in the car darker, heavier, Hannah saying under her breath that she had a bad feeling, that the tree wasn't random, and for once no one told her to stop being dramatic, not even Ben, who just gripped the wheel tighter and stared straight ahead. And that night they ate little, sat in silence, broken only by the occasional thump on the roof, likely branches they told themselves, or raccoons. Yet each sound made them all flinch, eyes darting toward the ceiling or the windows where shadows danced in the candlelight, and sometime after midnight when the fire had burned low and Jordan was dozing off in the armchair, there was a loud, sharp noise, like a hand slapping the back wall of the cabin, and everyone jumped, Mara grabbing Ben's arm as he bolted to his feet, flashlight in hand, swinging it toward the windows, but finding nothing, though the sound had been clear, deliberate, not an accident of nature. And for a while no one moved until Jordan, his voice shaking, said he wanted to go home. He didn't care how far the nearest town was. He'd walk if he had to. And for the first time, the fear in his voice made it real, made it valid. So they agreed that in the morning, they would all hike out together, leave the car, find someone to help clear the road, anything to get away. And eventually, one by one, they retreated to their rooms, though none of them truly slept, Mara lying in bed staring at the ceiling, the flicker of candlelight casting shadows that moved on their own, and somewhere in the middle of the night, she heard footsteps in the hallway, bare feet on old wood, soft and careful, then a long pause outside her door, so still it made her breath catch in her throat, and then the doorknob twisted ever so slightly, as if someone was testing it, not trying to enter yet, just checking if it would give, and she whispered Ben's name. But he didn't answer, so she sat up, her heart pounding, hand closing around the flashlight on the nightstand, flicking it on just as the knob stopped turning and the floorboards creaked away down the hall. And when she opened the door a minute later, the hallway was empty, lit by the faint glow of embers from the dying fire. The front door shut, the windows closed, everything seemingly untouched. And in the morning, when she asked the others if anyone had been up in the night, they all denied it, looking genuinely confused. But Mara noticed Jordan seemed paler, eyes shadowed, chewing his lip and glancing at the window every few seconds, and it was Ben who finally said, "We're leaving now." No more debate, no more breakfast, just boots on and bags packed. And as they stepped out into the gray morning light, backpacks tight, Mara looked toward the trees and saw, faintly, what might have been a figure watching from between two trunks, tall and unmoving, and when she blinked it was gone. But the sense of being watched remained, stronger than ever, and as they started down the trail, the forest felt wrong, too quiet, no birdsong, no insects, Only the sound of their own footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig behind them, always just far enough back to be deniable, but always there, like something was following them, matching their pace, waiting for them to slow down. They moved quickly at first, a tense silence between them broken only by the crunch of damp leaves and the occasional hiss of breath as they navigated the narrow trail, the canopy above filtering weak light that painted everything in muted greens and grays. And the deeper they went, the more the path seemed to shift, splitting into smaller routes that wound between dense clusters of trees, each one looking like the last, the moss thick on rocks and trunks, the air heavier with the smell of wet soil and decay. And after an hour, they realized with a creeping dread that they weren't sure where they were anymore. The landmarks from the day before absent or distorted. A hollow log that should have been near the stream nowhere to be seen. A crooked birch replaced by endless straight pines. And Jordan cursed under his breath, spinning slowly, as if the forest would reveal some hidden sign, while Hannah gripped her arms tightly, whispering that they had to keep moving, any direction, just move. And so they did, pushing through ferns and overgrown brambles until Mara spotted something ahead, a glint of fabric half buried under a tangle of roots, and she hurried forward despite Ben's warning shout, crouching to pull it free, her heart freezing when she realized it was not fabric but an old canvas backpack, soaked and heavy, the strap stiff with dried mud, and something darker, something that flaked off onto her hands, and when she unzipped it the smell hit her first, a sour, metallic tang that made her gag, and inside were items that didn't belong to them at all. A pair of faded jeans, torn at the knee and stiff with age, a cracked phone with a shattered screen, a silver locket crusted with rust and mud, and tucked in a side pocket a single white sneaker, small enough to have belonged to a woman, the sole peeling, the laces knotted, and Hannah stepped back sharply, one hand over her mouth, while Ben swore softly and knelt beside Mara, his eyes scanning the surrounding trees as if expecting someone to emerge and claim the find, and Jordan muttered, "This isn't from us," his voice trembling, and suddenly the forest felt alive, the distant creak of branches sounding too deliberate, the breeze carrying a sound like low laughter that twisted through the trees, and Mara dropped the backpack, her fingers slick with sweat, whispering that they had to go back to the cabin, regroup, call for help, anything. But before they could decide, a figure appeared between the trunks not 20 yards away, tall and gaunt, dressed in ragged clothes that hung like wet paper, his face shadowed by the hood of an old jacket, and he did not move, did not speak, only stood watching them, the stillness of his posture more terrifying than any threat. And Ben rose slowly, calling out, asking if he needed help, his voice strained, but the figure only tilted its head slightly, as though studying them. And then in the space of a blink he was gone, swallowed by the green shadows, leaving behind only the rustle of leaves, and Hannah began to cry, covering her face, while Jordan hissed that they were being hunted, that this was a trap, and Mara grabbed Ben's arm, dragging him toward the trail, the backpack abandoned, though the image of that locket burned in her mind, a memory of a missing person flyer she'd seen months ago online but couldn't place, and they half ran through the forest, branches slapping their faces, roots snagging their feet, until they burst back into the clearing of the cabin, lungs burning, only to find the front door wide open and the porch empty, the interior dark as though the windows had been covered, and Ben raised the flashlight though it was broad daylight, stepping in cautiously, calling out. But no one answered. No one should have been there, yet the air inside felt disturbed. The chairs moved slightly. One of the candles melted down completely, though no one had lit it. The scent of smoke faint and bitter, and on the kitchen table lay something that hadn't been there before, a single photograph, old and curled at the edges, showing 4 people in front of the same cabin decades ago, their faces blurred by age and exposure, but one figure in the back taller than the rest, standing apart, hooded, his face obscured in shadow, just like the man they had seen. And Mara felt her throat close as she backed away, whispering they needed to leave everything, just run. And as they turned toward the porch again, Jordan froze, staring at the far edge of the clearing, his voice barely audible as he said, "He's watching us." And when Mara looked, she saw him too, the same figure, closer this time, no longer still but taking slow steps toward them, deliberate, patient, as if certain they could not escape, and the woods behind him seemed to shift, dark shapes moving between the trees, the wind rising to a low howl that swallowed their frantic breathing, and Ben grabbed Mara's hand, pulling her toward the SUV, shouting at the others to move. But the engine coughed and sputtered, refusing to turn over, and in that moment Mara realized with a sickening clarity that they were trapped. Every path closed, the forest itself folding around them, the figure advancing with the steady gait of someone who had waited years for this moment, and as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, cold and sharp, she felt hope drain away, replaced by the raw instinct to survive, to run even if there was nowhere left to go. Ben slammed the key again and again, the engine giving only dry, guttural clicks, his knuckles white on the wheel, while Mara and Hannah clutched each other in the back seat, eyes darting between the windshield and the shifting tree line, Jordan pacing outside in the rain with a frantic energy, muttering curses under his breath, glancing toward the figure that now stood just beyond the clearing, as if the forest itself had placed him there, unmoving and yet unmistakably closer than before, his shoulders crooked, head tilted like a predator studying prey, and the sound of the rain on the metal roof of the SUV turned deafening, drowning out every rational thought until Ben shouted that they had to try the cabin again. Maybe there was a weapon, something they could use, and no one argued because the alternative was to stay in the vehicle that refused to move. So they bolted through the downpour, shoes sinking into mud, water running down their faces, hearts hammering in their ears, the cabin looming dark and crooked against the trembling trees, its open door like a gaping mouth, and when they burst inside the air was heavy with dampness and something sharper, a metallic tang that made Mara gag, the dim light from the stormy sky barely illuminating the cluttered room, chairs knocked over, drawers half open, and Ben began searching desperately, pulling open cabinets and tossing aside blankets, until he found a rusted hatchet in the corner near the fireplace, its blade pitted, and dull but still heavy in his grip, while Jordan ripped apart the shed outside, returning with a length of chain and a crowbar, his eyes wild, and Hannah whispered that they should barricade the door, but as they dragged furniture against it a sudden pounding from the back wall froze them, rhythmic and slow, as if someone were testing the structure itself, and then came a scrape along the window, high and long, the squeal of metal against glass, making Mara clap her hands over her ears, her breath coming fast and shallow, Ben raising the hatchet and moving toward the sound, but when he pulled the curtain aside there was nothing, only the gray of rain and forest, though a single handprint now smeared the glass, long-fingered and pale, the kind of hand that looked wrong, inhuman somehow, and Jordan swore, grabbing Mara's arm and whispering that they needed to go now, no more waiting, and so they darted out the back, slipping through the trees, the rain turning the ground slick and treacherous, branches whipping at their faces, their breaths ragged and loud, the cabin shrinking behind them until it disappeared completely, replaced by endless trunks and ferns, the forest twisting their sense of direction until every turn looked the same. But they didn't stop, didn't dare, until Hannah stumbled on a root and went down hard, crying out as she clutched her ankle, and Ben lifted her without hesitation, grunting with effort, Jordan leading the way though his hands trembled on the crowbar, the sound of their flight mingling with the steady, deliberate steps behind them, always behind them, closer with each passing minute, and then Mara saw it, a narrow trail she didn't remember from before, overgrown and half hidden by a fallen branch, and she screamed to the others to follow, plunging down it, the undergrowth ripping at her legs, the smell of wet earth thick in her nose, until suddenly the trees opened into another clearing, smaller than the one with the cabin, dominated by a stone structure half collapsed, an old well choked with vines, its stone slick with moss, and beside it lay a heap of things, backpacks, shoes, torn jackets, things that didn't belong together, all soaked and rotting, and as Mara stepped closer her stomach dropped, recognizing the same silver locket she'd found in the other bag, now resting in the mud beside a cracked phone identical to the one in her hand, and Hannah sobbed quietly, her fingers digging into Ben's jacket while Jordan whispered that this was where he kept them, this was where he brought them, his voice breaking on the words, and before they could move there came a low voice from the trees, calm and measured, saying, "You shouldn't have come here." and the figure stepped into the clearing, close enough now for them to see his face, or what was left of it, scarred and stretched, eyes too wide and unblinking, his movements slow as though savoring their fear. And Ben raised the hatchet, stepping forward, despite the shaking in his hands, telling Mara and Hannah to run, but the man only tilted his head, smiling faintly, a smile that felt wrong, practiced, and he took another step, then another, until Jordan lunged with the crowbar, swinging wildly, missing as the figure darted with surprising speed, grabbing the bar mid-swing and wrenching it from Jordan's hands, tossing it into the undergrowth, and Mara screamed as Ben charged, hatchet raised, the blade glancing off the man's shoulder with a dull thunk that brought no reaction except a deeper smile. And then there was movement in the trees, shapes flickering like shadows detached from their bodies, surrounding them, silent and quick, and Mara grabbed Hannah's hand, dragging her toward the far side of the clearing, screaming for Ben to follow, Jordan stumbling behind, the sound of footsteps multiplying, echoing, until the rain seemed to vanish under the pounding of blood in her ears, the forest folding around them again, and as they fled, branches tearing at their arms, Mara dared one glance back to see Ben still swinging the hatchet, the figure still advancing unfazed, the clearing swallowing them in mist as the trees closed in, and somewhere ahead through the storm, she thought she saw a faint glimmer of light, a possibility, a chance, and she didn't stop running. ChatGPT. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs trembled, the forest blurring into streaks of green and gray, the rain turning the ground to a slick mire that clung to their shoes and threatened to swallow them whole, Hannah sobbing raggedly as Mara half-carried her, Jordan stumbling behind with wide eyes, whispering over and over that they weren't going to make it, that nothing in these woods ever got out. But Mara kept pushing, driven by a raw instinct, by the faint glow she'd seen through the trees, and after what felt like hours they broke into another clearing, smaller, ringed by massive oaks whose roots rose like twisted serpents, and in the center stood a crumbling stone tower, only 2 stories high. Its roof caved in, a relic from some forgotten era, but it was shelter, and it had a heavy wooden door, still hanging crooked on rusted hinges, and with no time to think they dragged it closed behind them, hearts hammering as they pressed their backs against the cold stone walls. The smell of mildew and rot thick in the air, faint light filtering through cracks in the stones, and for a few moments there was only their panting and the drip of rain through the broken ceiling, until a sound came from outside, a soft crunch of footsteps circling, the faint scrape of something metallic against the door, and Hannah whimpered, clutching Mara's arm, while Jordan whispered that they couldn't stay. They needed to move, but before they could argue, a sudden crash echoed through the clearing, a voice low and amused calling out, "I can wait as long as I need." And Mara felt cold spread through her chest as she realized he wasn't in a hurry, that he was used to the waiting, that the woods themselves seemed to obey him. And then Ben appeared in the doorway, soaked, bleeding from a gash on his arm but alive, his eyes wide and wild as he shoved the door fully open and hissed at them to run while he still held them off. And Mara cried out his name, rushing to him, but Ben shook, his head fiercely, pushing her back, telling her to go, to get Hannah and Jordan out now. And then Mara saw behind him the shadow that moved like liquid, the tall man stepping into the light. Blood streaked across his chest where the hatchet had cut him, but his expression unchanged, calm, almost curious, and he whispered something too soft to hear before lunging, and Ben swung the hatchet again, buying them seconds, just seconds, enough for Mara to drag Hannah toward a narrow side door she hadn't noticed before, Jordan helping despite his shaking hands, and they burst through into the rain again, into the dark press of the forest, running with no sense of direction, only the need to move, to put distance between themselves and that tower, the sounds of struggle behind them fading into the storm, and then the forest began to thin, the trees smaller, the ground rising into a slope, and Mara's heart leapt as she saw through the mist a flicker of motion, orange jackets, flashlights, cutting through the gray, voices calling, searchers, rangers, people, and she screamed, her voice cracking, waving an arm until 2 figures sprinted toward them, strong hands grabbing her shoulders, steady voices telling her she was safe. It was okay now, though she kept screaming Ben's name, pointing back toward the woods, But when the rangers moved in that direction, the man and the tower were gone. Only endless trees and rain and a silence that felt deeper than before. And in the days that followed, Mara sat in a sterile room giving statements again and again, her voice hoarse, her memories replaying on loop. The figure in the clearing, the pile of belongings, the sound of that soft voice saying he could wait forever. While Hannah lay in a hospital bed with a cast on her ankle, Jordan pale and trembling through his interviews, none of them able to explain how those woods seemed to swallow Ben without a trace. And then, weeks later, long after the official search had wound down and the headlines had shifted to other tragedies, a hunter wandering those same woods stumbled upon a rusted hatchet half buried near a stream, its handle worn smooth by time, and beside it a shallow depression in the soil, as though something heavy had once been dragged there. And when the investigators returned, they found more scraps of fabric, a rusted chain, a ring of stones blackened by old fire, and deeper in a narrow cave hidden by brush they uncovered bones, dozens of them, some years old, some decades, and among them a torn jacket that Mara recognized instantly as Ben's, the sight dropping her to her knees, tears mixing with the dirt as a terrible calm settled over her, because the truth was no longer a shadow. It was here, undeniable, a record of every life taken in those woods by a man who had lived unseen for years, maybe longer, slipping between the trees like a ghost, feeding on fear and isolation. And though they never found him, though he remained a shadow whispered about, in town and online, Mara stood at the edge of that forest months later, the wind stirring her hair, and she placed a simple wooden cross at the tree line for Ben, for the others, for anyone lost to the dark, whispering that they had not been forgotten, that someone had seen. And as she turned to leave, she thought she heard movement in the distance, a soft laugh carried on the wind, and she didn't look back, walking away with tears on her cheeks and the haunting knowledge that some places never let go, that some evils are patient enough to wait forever,